The name Carlos Rivas carried weight in two worlds that should never have intersected. In the glittering cocaine empire of the 1980s, he was royalty, a founding member of the Medellin Cartel, the architect of Norman's Cay, the island paradise turned drug superhighway. In the cold calculus of American drug enforcement, he was something else entirely. Target number one, the man who had turned the Caribbean into his personal smuggling route, flooding American cities with billions of dollars worth of powder that destroyed families and corrupted institutions. But on this particular morning in 1987, Carlos later was neither king nor target. He was a prisoner sitting in a concrete cell in Barranquilla, Colombia, waiting for a fate he could sense approaching like distant thunder. At 37 years old, his face still held the sharp intelligence that had built an empire, but the lines around his eyes had deepened. Prison had a way of aging men faster than time itself. He sat on the edge of his cot, a thin mattress over metal springs that had been home to countless men before him. The cell was sparse, a toilet in the corner that barely worked, a small sink with rust stains running from the faucet to the drain, and a single barred window that let in a slice of tropical sunlight. The walls were covered in scratches, names, dates, messages from the forgotten. Some men carved their names to be remembered. Carlos had no need for that. His name was already etched into history. The prison itself was a hierarchy within a hierarchy, a microcosm of Colombian society compressed into violence and survival. On paper, all inmates were equal under the law. In reality, the prison was divided into territories as clearly marked as any cartel's turf. The narcos occupied the better cells, the ones with windows that actually opened, where money could buy television sets, better food, even conjugal visits. The common criminals, thieves, murderers, rapists occupied the middle tiers, navigating between the power above and the desperate below. At the bottom were the forgotten, the indigent, the mentally ill, the ones without family or money or hope. Carlos existed in a strange liminal space. His wealth and reputation granted him certain privileges, but his very presence made him a target. The Colombian government had arrested him under intense American pressure, and everyone knew it. To some inmates, he was a hero, a man who had stood up to the gringos and made them pay attention. To others, he was a traitor to Colombia, a man who had brought American heat down on everyone in the trade. And to a select few, the ones who mattered, the ones connected to rival cartels or bought by competing interests, he was an opportunity. The morning routine in the prison was a symphony of institutional monotony. The guards made their rounds at 6 a.m. sharp, banging batons against cell bars, shouting for everyone to wake. The sound echoed through concrete corridors like a metallic dawn. Breakfast was distributed at 7, usually rice, sometimes beans, occasionally a piece of bread that tasted like cardboard soaked in disappointment. Carlos ate everything given to him. In prison, you never knew when your next meal might be your last or when someone might decide to poison it. In the communal yard, the hierarchies became visible. The narcos congregated in one corner, smoking cigarettes that cost 10 times what they should, discussing the outside world with the nostalgia of exiled kings. Carlos sometimes joined them, but more often he kept to himself. He had learned long ago that in prison, friendships were currencies that could be spent or stolen without warning. Better to be cordial, respectful, but ultimately alone. He spent his mornings reading when he could get books. Philosophy mostly, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre. The existentialist made sense in a place like this where existence itself was stripped down to its barest elements: survival, dignity, the assertion of self against the grinding machinery of confinement. He had always been drawn to ideas even before the cocaine, even before the millions. His father had been a German engineer, his mother Colombian. He had grown up between worlds, never quite fitting into either, always looking for something that made sense of the contradiction. The afternoon of the fourth day of his second week in Barranquilla began like any other. The heat was oppressive, the kind of wet tropical heat that made the air feel solid, something you had to push through to move. Carlos was in the yard, standing near the western wall where a sliver of shade offered minimal relief. He was watching a soccer game, inmates playing with a ball that was more tape than leather, their shouts and laughter a temporary escape from reality. That's when he noticed them. Three men moving with the deliberate casualness of predators who had already decided on their prey. He recognized the one in front, Miguel El Pulpo Ochoa, a mid-level enforcer for the Cali cartel. The other two were muscle, the kind of men whose eyes held no thought beyond the next act of violence. They were walking toward him with a purpose that made every instinct in Carlos's body scream warning. In prison, you develop a sixth sense for danger. The air changes, conversations drop in volume, people suddenly find reasons to be elsewhere. Carlos saw inmates beginning to drift away from his vicinity, their movements subtle but unmistakable. The guards who should have been watching were conveniently looking the other way. Someone had paid them off, someone always did. Carlos straightened, rolling his shoulders back, his mind racing through options. Run, but where? In the yard, there was nowhere to go. Fight 3 against 1, and at least one of them would have a shank. Talk maybe, but the look in El Pulpo's eyes suggested negotiations were already closed. Later, El Pulpo called out when they were 10 feet away, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to have a conversation." Carlos kept his face neutral, but inside his thoughts were moving at lightning speed. This is about the extradition. The Cali people are worried I'll make a deal, give up names, trade information for leniency. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe this is just a message from someone who wants me gone. "I'm always happy to talk, Miguel," Carlos replied, keeping his voice steady. "Though I notice you brought friends. Must be an important conversation." The other inmates had cleared a wide circle now. The soccer game had stopped. Everyone was watching the way people watch car accidents, horrified but unable to look away. This was entertainment, drama, a break in the monotony. This was also a power play, a demonstration of who mattered and who didn't. Il Pulpo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know how it is, Carlos. Dangerous times. A man needs protection." "From me?" Carlos spread his hands, showing they were empty. "I'm just a guest of the government, Miguel. No threat to anyone." "That's the problem," one of the muscles said, speaking for the first time. "You're a guest, but guests sometimes talk to their hosts, share secrets, make arrangements." So that was it. They thought he was going to cooperate with the Americans, give them information to save himself from extradition. Carlos felt a flash of anger, not at the accusation, which was logical enough, but at the inevitability of what was about to happen. In this world, suspicion was enough. Intent didn't need proof. "I haven't said a word to anyone," Carlos said quietly, "and I won't. Whatever you think I might do, you're wrong." El Pulpo took another step forward. The afternoon sun glinted off something in his right hand, a shank, crude but effective, probably a sharpened piece of metal wrapped in cloth for grip. "That's good to hear, Carlos. Really good. But my employers, they prefer certainty over promises. You understand?" Carlos understood perfectly. This wasn't about deterrence. This was about elimination. And in the split second before El Pulpo moved, Carlos made a decision. If they were going to kill him, they were going to work for it. He was Carlos Leder Rivas, and he would not die quietly. The first strike came fast, El Pulpo lunging forward with the shank aimed at Carlos's midsection. Carlos twisted, feeling the blade slice through his shirt and across his ribs, a burning line of pain, but not deep enough to stop him. He grabbed El Pulpo's wrist with both hands, using the man's momentum to pull him forward and off balance. They crashed together, and Carlos brought his knee up hard into El Pulpo's stomach. The man grunted, his breath exploding out, but the other two were already on Carlos, fists and feet connecting with brutal efficiency. Carlos felt a rib crack, tasted blood in his mouth, but he kept fighting, throwing elbows, trying to create space to survive just one more second. The yard erupted in shouts. Some inmates were cheering, others calling for guards, most just watching with the cold fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial combat. Carlos hit the ground hard, his head bouncing off concrete, and the world spun. He could see boots coming toward his face, and he tried to roll away, but hands grabbed him, holding him down. Il Pulpo was above him now, the shank raised, and Carlos could see his own death in that blade. But he met Il Pulpo's eyes and didn't look away, didn't beg, didn't give them the satisfaction of fear. In that moment, he thought of his island of Norman's Cay, when it was paradise, of flying low over blue water with a plane full of cocaine, feeling invincible and free. The blade started to descend, and Carlos later closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in defiance. If this was the end, he would meet it on his own terms, with his dignity intact, a king even in death. The shank descended in what felt like slow motion, time stretching and compressing simultaneously. Carlos could see every detail, the crude serrations on the blade's edge, the tremor in El Pulpo's hand that suggested this wasn't his first kill, but perhaps his most significant, the droplets of sweat falling from the man's brow like rain before a storm. Then, just as the blade would have found his throat, a whistle pierced the air, sharp and authoritative. "Freeze! Everyone on the ground now." The voice belonged to Captain Morales, the one guard in the facility who still pretended the rules mattered. El Pulpo hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation, Carlos saw his chance. He bucked his hips violently, throwing off one of the men holding him, and twisted to the side. The blade came down, but caught only dirt and concrete where his neck had been. Carlos rolled, his ribs screaming in protest, and came up into a crouch. Blood was running down his side from the slash across his ribs, and he could feel another cut above his left eye that he didn't remember receiving. The world tilted slightly, adrenaline and possible concussion creating a surreal filter over reality. But he was alive, and in prison, alive was winning. Il Pulpo stood frozen, the shank still in his hand, weighing his options. Carlos could almost see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes: kill letter and face certain punishment, or back off and face uncertain consequences from whoever had ordered the hit. More whistles blew now, guards pouring into the yard from multiple entrances. The window for murder had closed, at least for the moment. "Drop the weapon, Miguel," Captain Morales ordered, his hand on his sidearm. "Drop it now or I drop you, your choice." For a long moment, El Pulpo didn't move. Then slowly he let the shank fall to the ground, where it clattered against concrete with a sound like breaking teeth. His face was a mask of frustrated rage, but he raised his hands, showing compliance. His two associates did the same, though one of them spat toward Carlos, a gesture of contempt that spoke volumes about unfinished business. Carlos tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by waves of pain that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. His ribs felt like broken glass grinding together with each breath. His head pounded with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat but amplified it into a drum solo of agony. He tasted copper and salt, blood from somewhere in his mouth mixing with sweat. Captain Morales approached him carefully, his weapon still drawn but pointed at the ground. "Don't move, letter. Medical is on the way." Medical, Carlos thought with bitter amusement. In this place, medical means a drunk orderly with vodka for disinfectant and prayers for anesthesia, but he nodded anyway, or tried to. The movement sent another spike of pain through his skull, and the world darkened at the edges. He could hear El Pulpo being cuffed, the metallic click of restraints, the protest that he was just defending himself, that later had attacked first. Standard lies, the kind that might actually work depending on which guards had been bribed and which politicians were making phone calls. In Colombia, truth was negotiable, especially when American interests were involved and everyone wanted the problem to go away. More guards arrived, forming a perimeter around Carlos while the yard was cleared. The other inmates filed back to their cells with backward glances, already crafting the stories they'd tell about what they'd seen. By tomorrow, the narrative would be completely different depending on who was telling it. Carlos had been jumped. Carlos had started it. Carlos had fought off 10 men. Carlos had gone down like a coward. In prison, legend and reality divorced quickly. Two orderlies arrived with a stretcher, their movements efficient but rough. They weren't gentle as they lifted Carlos onto it, and he couldn't suppress a groan as his broken rib shifted. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this environment, muttered an apology. The other, older and harder, said nothing, his face carefully neutral in the way of people who had learned that compassion could be dangerous. They carried him across the yard through corridors he'd walked 100 times, but which now seemed alien through the lens of pain. Other inmates watched from their cells, faces pressed against bars, some calling out questions or encouragement, others silent as ghosts. Carlos kept his eyes on the ceiling, counting fluorescent lights as they passed underneath, a meditation technique to stay conscious and alert. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 4, 5, 6, breathe. Don't pass out. Passing out means vulnerability. Vulnerability means death. The medical wing was a generous term for a room with 2 cots, a metal cabinet of supplies that would have been inadequate for a rural clinic in peacetime, and a sink that rarely worked. Dr. Vargas was already there, a skeletal man in his 60s who had once been a real doctor before cocaine and gambling had cost him his license. He still knew his craft, though, his hands steady despite the tremor of withdrawal that affected them between patients. "Put him on the table," Dr. Vargas ordered, and the orderlies complied, sliding Carlos onto a cot with sheets that might have been white once, but were now the gray of institutional neglect. The doctor approached, his eyes scanning Carlos's injuries with professional detachment. Abdominal laceration, possible fractured rib, contusions on the face and torso, possible concussion. He recited more to himself than to anyone listening. "Letter, can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" "Barranquilla prison," Carlos managed, his voice rough. "Medical wing. You're Dr. Vargas. I have all my faculties, doctor, except the faculty of not being stabbed." A ghost of a smile crossed Vargas's face. "Good. Humor means the brain is still working. This is going to hurt. We don't have proper anesthesia." "Story of my life," Carlos replied and braced himself. The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the abdominal wound first. When the alcohol hit the raw flesh, Carlos's entire body went rigid, his hands gripping the sides of the cot hard enough to turn his knuckles white. He bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming, tasting fresh blood, but a sound escaped anyway, a low guttural noise that was more animal than human. Pain is just information, he told himself, a mantra from somewhere in his past, the body's way of saying it's still alive. Feel it, acknowledge it, but don't let it own you. The stitches came next, each one an individual moment of agony as the needle pierced torn flesh and the thread pulled everything tight. Carlos counted them, 9 in total for the abdominal wound, 9 points where his body was being forcibly held together by artificial means, 9 reminders that he had come very close to ending on a prison yard like so many others before him. Dr. Vargas moved to his ribs, his fingers probing with clinical precision that nonetheless sent fresh waves of pain radiating through Carlos's torso. Fractured, not broken, he announced. I'll wrap them, but you need to minimize movement for at least 3 weeks. In this place, I know that's asking the impossible, but try. I'll pencil in a vacation to Cartagena, Carlos said through gritted teeth, maybe some beach time umbrella drinks. The wrapping was tight enough to restrict breathing, and Carlos had to consciously force air in and out of his lungs in shallow sips. Every breath was a negotiation with pain, a reminder of mortality and fragility. Vargas finished with the head wound, applying butterfly bandages to close it without stitches. You'll live, the doctor said finally, stepping back to survey his work. But Leonard, whoever wanted you dead today will try again. This isn't over. I know, Carlos replied quietly. It's never over until you're in the ground, sometimes not even then. Captain Morales entered the room then, his expression unreadable. He'd been standing guard outside, and now he approached the cot with the careful neutrality of a man navigating political minefields. Letter, I need your statement about what happened. Carlos almost laughed, but it would have hurt too much. My statement. 3 men attacked me in the yard. I defended myself. End of statement. Names? Miguel Ochoa and 2 others I didn't recognize. But, Captain, you and I both know names don't matter. Whoever wanted this to happen has enough money to make any investigation disappear. You know it. I know it. So let's not pretend otherwise. Morales' jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. For a moment, Carlos thought he saw genuine frustration there, maybe even sympathy, but it passed quickly, replaced by professional distance. Ochoa and his associates are in solitary. You'll be placed in protective custody for your own safety. Protective custody, Carlos repeated, understanding immediately what that meant. Solitary confinement, you mean? I'm being punished for being attacked. I'm keeping you alive, Morales corrected. There's a difference. Perhaps there was, Carlos thought, but the distinction felt academic when the result was the same. Isolation, deprivation, the slow erosion of the mind that solitary confinement inevitably brought. But he also understood the logic in the general population. He was a walking target. In solitary, he was at least protected from other inmates, if not from the guards themselves. How long, Carlos asked. As long as necessary, Morales replied, which meant indefinite, which meant until someone decided his fate one way or another, extradition, assassination, or some third option no one had thought of yet. The orderlies returned to transport him to solitary. This time they were more careful, having received some signal from either the doctor or the captain that this particular prisoner warranted slightly better treatment. They loaded him back onto the stretcher and began the journey through different corridors downstairs into the deeper parts of the prison, where the architecture changed from merely brutal to actively oppressive. The solitary wings smelled different, less of human habitation, more of concrete and decay and time standing still. The cells here were smaller, darker, designed for punishment rather than mere containment. They passed other cells, and Carlos could hear sounds from within, muttering, crying, the occasional scream that was quickly muffled. Men went into solitary and came out changed, if they came out at all. His cell was at the end of the corridor, the last one before the hallway terminated in a solid wall. The orderlies unlocked it and helped him off the stretcher, their support the only thing keeping him upright. Inside was a space perhaps 6 feet by 8, containing a concrete shelf that served as a bed, a toilet, and nothing else. No window, no light except what came from the corridor when someone opened the slot in the door. They lowered him onto the concrete shelf, and the younger orderly said quietly, "Good luck, senor." Then they were gone, and the door clanged shut with a finality that seemed to echo in Carlos's bones. He heard the lock turn, the sound of footsteps retreating, and then silence, the deep, absolute silence that comes when you're alone and underground and far from anything that matters. Carlos lay on the concrete, his body screaming pain from a dozen different injuries, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges of survival in this new environment. Above him, somewhere in the darkness beyond seeing, he imagined he could hear water dripping, the slow, patient erosion of stone by nothing more than persistence and time. This is a test, he told himself. Everything is a test. The question is whether you pass or break. And Carlos Leda Rivas, drug lord and revolutionary, king of an island and enemy of empires, closed his eyes and began to count his breaths, each one a small victory against pain and fear and the crushing weight of solitude. The first 48 hours in solitary existed outside of normal time. With no window and no natural light, Carlos's circadian rhythm collapsed almost immediately. He slept when pain permitted and stayed awake when it didn't, which meant fragments of consciousness scattered across hours that could have been minutes or days. The cell's darkness was nearly absolute, except when guards opened the slot to slide in a tray of food or perform their perfunctory wellness checks. Dr. Vargas came on the second day, or what Carlos assumed was the second day. The doctor examined his stitches with a flashlight held between his teeth, his movements quick and professional despite the awkward positioning. The abdominal wound was holding, he reported, though the edges showed signs of inflammation that could become infection without proper antibiotics. The ribs were what they were, fractured, wrapped, healing at whatever pace the body determined. Any fever? Vargas asked, pressing the back of his hand against Carlos's forehead in the ancient diagnostic gesture of physicians. No more than usual in this sauna, Carlos replied. The cell's temperature was oppressive, the concrete walls trapping heat like a kiln. He was constantly covered in a sheen of sweat that made his clothes cling and his skin itch. I'm leaving you antibiotics, the doctor said, producing a small bottle of pills from his bag. Take one every 8 hours. Don't skip doses even if you feel better. Infection in a wound like this can turn septic, and we don't have the facilities to handle that. What happens if it does turn septic? Vargas met his eyes, and the answer was there without words. Men died in prison from infected wounds all the time. The official reports usually said natural causes or complications from pre-existing conditions. The truth was more prosaic: neglect, inadequate medical care, and the institutional indifference to inmate suffering. Don't let it, Vargas said simply. You're stubborn enough to spite death itself, letter. Use that. After the doctor left, Carlos examined the pills in the dim light from the door slot. They could be antibiotics. They could also be poison or placebos or anything else. In prison, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But infection was a certainty without treatment, so he swallowed the first pill and decided to gamble on Vargas's professional ethics over his potential corruption. The pain was manageable now, transmuted from acute agony to a constant low-grade ache that colored everything. His ribs protested every breath, his sutured abdomen pulled when he moved, and his head maintained a steady throb that suggested the concussion hadn't fully resolved. But Carlos had learned to compartmentalize pain, to acknowledge it without letting it dominate his consciousness. Pain is just noise, he thought, static in the signal. The real question is what signal you're trying to receive. On the third day, he was fairly certain it was the third day, though his confidence in that assessment was declining. Captain Morales visited. The guard opened the door fully for the first time, allowing actual light to flood the cell. Carlos had to shield his eyes against the sudden brightness, even though the corridor lights were themselves dim. How are you healing? Morales asked, though his tone suggested the question was more procedural than genuinely concerned. Well enough to eventually be killed, Carlos replied. Is that what you came to check on? Whether I'm recovered enough for the next attempt? Morales's expression tightened. I came to inform you of the official report. The incident in the yard has been investigated. You and Miguel Ochoa engaged in a mutual altercation stemming from personal grievances. Both parties have been sanctioned with 30 days in solitary confinement. Carlos laughed, though it hurt his ribs. Personal grievances, is that what we're calling assassination attempts now? Very diplomatic, Captain. It's the version that's been accepted by the warden and will be sent to the Justice Ministry, Morales said flatly. You can dispute it if you want, file a formal complaint, request an external investigation, and those processes take, 6 months, a year, by which time I'll be extradited or dead, whichever comes first. Morales didn't deny it. Instead, he produced a folded document from his pocket. You also received this from the American Embassy. Carlos took the paper with fingers that trembled slightly, though whether from weakness or emotion, he couldn't say. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the legal language that transformed human fate into administrative procedure. It was a notice of extradition proceedings, formal notification that the United States government was requesting his transfer to face drug trafficking charges in Jacksonville, Florida. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to import cocaine, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The penalties were equally extensive: possible life imprisonment without parole. The Americans weren't playing around. They wanted to make an example of him to show that even the powerful could be brought down. When? Carlos asked, his voice carefully neutral. No date set yet. The Colombian government is still considering whether to approve the extradition. There are political complications. Carlos understood those complications intimately. The narcos had spent millions building political alliances, and many Colombian politicians were philosophically opposed to extradition on nationalist grounds. The Constitution itself was ambiguous on the question, but American pressure was immense, and Colombia's government was weak, dependent on U.S. aid and goodwill. So I wait in this hole while politicians decide my fate, Carlos said. How democratic? You'll be safe here, Morales offered, though even he sounded unconvinced. No other inmates can reach you. Just the guards, you mean? Tell me, Captain, how much would it take to bribe someone to kill me in solitary? $1,000? $5,000? I'm curious what my life is worth on the current market. Morales's face became a mask. I wouldn't know. I don't engage in such transactions. But others do, and we both know it. The captain had no response to that. He simply folded the extradition notice back up, set it on the concrete shelf that served as Carlos's bed, and left without another word. The door clanged shut, and Carlos was alone again with his thoughts and his fears. He read the extradition notice again more carefully this time, examining every clause and subclauses. The Americans had built a comprehensive case, pulling together testimony from informants, surveillance records, financial documents. They had traced his operations from Norman's Cay to the streets of Miami, quantifying his empire in kilograms and dollars, and destroyed lives. They're not wrong, Carlos thought. With something approaching objective clarity, I did all of it, built the routes, bribed the officials, moved the product. I was good at it, better than good. I was exceptional, and now the bill comes due. But even as he acknowledged his guilt, he rejected their moral authority to judge him. The Americans who wanted to imprison him were the same Americans who had consumed his product eagerly, who had created the demand that his supply merely satisfied. They were hypocrites, punishing the pusherman while ignoring the addict in the mirror. The days blurred together after that. Carlos established a routine the way prisoners always did when faced with the shapeless void of confinement. He woke, or approximated waking, since sleep and consciousness were increasingly difficult to distinguish, and immediately checked his wounds. The stitches held, the inflammation receded thanks to the antibiotics, and his ribs began their slow knitting process. He exercised within the limitations of his injuries. Push-ups modified to favor his healing ribs, sit-ups carefully avoiding strain on the abdominal wound, squats and lunges in the tiny space available. His body had been a tool of his ambition for years, kept fit through tennis and swimming in his island paradise. Now it was a vehicle for survival, something to be maintained despite the deteriorating conditions. The meals came 3 times daily, or he assumed they did. Rice, beans, occasionally a piece of meat so processed it was unrecognizable. He ate everything, forcing nutrition into his body even when his appetite had been destroyed by pain and isolation. Calories were resistance, protein was defiance. Every bite was a refusal to give them the satisfaction of watching him waste away. But the real battle wasn't physical, it was psychological. Solitary confinement was designed to break the mind, to erode the self through sensory deprivation and social isolation. Carlos had read about this, had even discussed it academically with fellow narcos who had done stretches in American supermax prisons, but reading about it and experiencing it were entirely different. The silence was the worst part. In the general population, there was always noise, voices, footsteps, the ambient sound of human habitation. In solitary, there was nothing, just his own breathing, his own heartbeat, and occasionally the distant echo of something happening in another part of the prison. His mind, desperate for stimulation, began manufacturing sounds, phantom footsteps, imagined voices, auditory hallucinations that he recognized as such but couldn't stop from occurring. To combat this, Carlos talked to himself out loud at first, then in whispers when he began to worry that the guards might think he was losing his sanity. He recited poetry he had memorized in school, German verses from Goethe and Schiller that his father had taught him. He narrated his own thoughts, creating a dialogue with an imaginary interlocutor who challenged his ideas and forced him to defend his positions. Why did you do it, Carlos? He would ask himself. Why build an empire on powder and poison? If it was there to be built, he would answer, because I could. Because the world is divided into winners and losers, and I refuse to be the latter. And now? Now you're in a concrete box waiting for extradition or assassination. Was it worth it? This question he struggled with, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with no solution. The money had been extraordinary, billions of dollars flowing through his hands like water. The power had been intoxicating, politicians and generals dancing to his tune, an entire island nation bent to his will. The freedom had been absolute, flying where he wanted, doing what he wanted, living beyond the constraints that bound ordinary men. But the cost had also been extraordinary. Friends dead, allies turned enemies, a life lived in constant paranoia where everyone was a potential informant or assassin, and now imprisonment and probable extradition to spend the rest of his life in an American cage. Was it worth it? The question echoed in the darkness, and Carlos found he didn't have a simple answer. On what he estimated was the 10th day, the infection he'd feared came anyway. He woke or became conscious, the distinction meaningless, with a fever that made his whole body shake. His wound was hot to the touch, angry red spreading from the stitched line like a map of invasion. The antibiotics had slowed it but not stopped it. He banged on the door until a guard came, then explained the situation through the slot. The guard disappeared and Carlos lay back down on the concrete trying to control his shivering. Hours passed, or minutes. Time had become completely unreliable before Dr. Vargas appeared. The doctor took one look at the wound and cursed softly in Spanish. "This needs to be opened and drained. I'll need to remove some stitches." "Do it," Carlos said. There was no choice, no debate. The infection would kill him if untreated. Vargas worked by flashlight again, his hands steady despite the difficult conditions. He removed 3 stitches and Carlos felt warm liquid, pus mixed with blood, drained from the wound. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, like a pressure valve being released. The doctor cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied fresh antibiotic ointment, and rebandaged it loosely. No restitching until the infection clears, Vargas explained. Keep it clean and dry. I'm doubling your antibiotic dose. If the fever doesn't break in 24 hours, we'll have to consider moving you to a real hospital. They won't do that, Carlos said with certainty. Too much risk of escape or rescue. Better to let me die here where it's contained. Vargas didn't contradict him, which was answer enough. He left the doubled antibiotics and departed, leaving Carlos alone with his reopened wound and the gnawing fear that this was how it would end, not with a bullet or an extradition, but with septic infection in a solitary cell, his body consuming itself from the inside. But Carlos Leder Rivas had not built an empire by giving in to fear. He took the antibiotics, forced himself to drink water even when his fever made everything taste like metal, and focused his mind on survival with the same intensity he had once focused on smuggling routes and profit margins. Not like this, he told himself through the fever dreams and hallucinations. I don't end like this. I end on my feet, not on my back in the dark. The fever broke on the 3rd day, his body's natural defenses combining with the antibiotics to turn the tide. He woke, truly woke this time with clarity of mind he hadn't felt in days, to find himself soaked in sweat but clear-headed. The wound still hurt, but the heat was gone, the spreading redness retreating back to the stitched line. He had survived again. The thought brought a grim satisfaction, but also a weariness that went soul deep. How many times could one man survive before survival itself became the punishment? In the darkness of his cell, listening to the phantom sounds his continued 2335 mind created to fill the silence, Carlos Leder began to understand that this was the true sentence. Not death, but this, the slow attrition of the self, the gradual erosion of identity in the face of institutional indifference and calculated cruelty. But understanding the game didn't mean surrendering to it. If they wanted to break him, they would have to work for every crack, every fracture. He was Carlos Leder Rivas, and his mind was the last empire they couldn't touch. The first full week after the infection cleared, Carlos instituted a regime of mental discipline that would have seemed obsessive if it weren't absolutely necessary for survival. He had read once in some book on military survival training that prisoners of war maintain sanity through structure, creating schedules, setting tasks, imposing order on chaos. In solitary confinement, where the external world provided no structure whatsoever, the mind had to become its own clockmaker. He began each day, or what he designated as day, since the darkness made no distinction, with a physical inventory. Lying on the concrete shelf, he would systematically assess his body from head to toe. Wiggle toes, flex ankles, bend knees, each joint, each muscle cataloged and confirmed as functional. The ritual served dual purposes. It kept him aware of his physical state, and it grounded him in his corporeal existence when the isolation threatened to make him feel like a disembodied consciousness floating in void. The wound was healing finally and truly. Dr. Vargas had returned to restitch it once the infection cleared, and this time the sutures held without complication. The scar would be significant, a raised line across his abdomen that would mark him forever, but Carlos found he didn't care about cosmetics. Scars were stories written on skin, proof of survival. He had collected many over the years. This would simply be another. His ribs remained problematic, the fractured bone knitting slowly through some mysterious calculus of calcium and time. He continued to wrap them himself when the bandaging loosened, a process that required careful manipulation and shallow breathing. Each morning he tested their progress by taking incrementally deeper breaths, pushing the limit of pain just slightly to encourage healing without risking further injury. After the physical inventory came exercises modified for the constraints of the cell and his healing body. Push-ups first, starting with 10 and adding 1 each day. The progression was arbitrary but important. It gave him something to achieve, however small. Then sit-ups, careful to avoid straining the abdominal wound. Squats, lunges in the tiny space available, turning precisely at the walls like a caged animal that had learned the dimensions of its cage down to the millimeter. The exercise served multiple functions beyond physical fitness. It was a way to mark time, each set a discrete unit that accumulated into days and weeks. It was a method of temperature regulation, working up enough sweat to feel the evaporation cooling his skin in the oppressive heat. And most importantly, it was an act of defiance, a daily assertion that he remained in control of his body, even if everything else had been stripped away. After exercise came breakfast. Whatever thin gruel or stale bread the guards slid through the slot, Carlos ate with deliberation, chewing each bite thoroughly, extracting every calorie. He had lost weight in solitary, his frame leaning out from the combination of poor nutrition and constant stress, but he remained functional, and that was what mattered. Then came the intellectual work, the real labor of maintaining sanity in isolation. Carlos had always been a reader, his mind hungry for ideas and information. In the cell with no books and no external stimulation, he was forced to become his own library. He began systematically reconstructing from memory every book he had ever read. He started with childhood favorites, adventure stories, tales of pirates and explorers. He would recall the plot, the characters, the specific scenes, replaying them in his mind with as much detail as possible. Then philosophy texts from his university days, the dense arguments of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Kant. He couldn't remember every word, but he could remember the frameworks, the logical progressions, the essential insights that had shaped his thinking. This reconstruction served multiple purposes. It occupied hours of time that would otherwise be filled with madness. It kept his cognitive functions sharp, his memory active, his analytical abilities honed, and it created an internal world rich enough to counter the sensory deprivation of the external environment. When he exhausted his memory of books, Carlos turned to mathematics. He had studied engineering briefly before dropping out to pursue other interests, and the mathematical knowledge remained like a dormant language waiting to be reactivated. He started with simple problems, mental arithmetic that grew progressively more complex, multiplication of three-digit numbers, square roots calculated through approximation, geometric proofs worked out in the darkness, invisible triangles and circles existing only in his mind's eye. The mathematics was particularly effective at occupying his consciousness. It required total concentration, leaving no room for the anxiety and despair that lurked at the edges of awareness. A difficult integration or differential equation could consume an hour or more, and when solved, provided a satisfaction that was almost narcotic in its completeness. In the afternoons, his arbitrary designation for the middle period of each 24-hour cycle, Carlos worked on languages. His father had taught him German, his mother Spanish, and he had picked up English in the United States during his brief period of legal residence. He now attempted to teach himself French, using the limited phrases and vocabulary he had absorbed from restaurant menus and airport signs during his travels. He conjugated verbs he barely knew, constructed sentences that were probably grammatically catastrophic, held entire conversations with imaginary Frenchmen about imaginary topics. It didn't matter if he was getting it right. The point was the engagement, the activation of those parts of his brain responsible for language acquisition and pattern recognition. The language study also served another purpose. It was preparation for a future he refused to believe would never come, when not if, but when he got out of this cell, he would need every skill and ability intact. Languages would be useful whether in Colombia or the United States or wherever his life took him next. The assumption of a future was itself an act of resistance against the crushing weight of the present. Evenings were reserved for strategic thinking, for the kind of analysis that had made him successful in the drug trade. Carlos would mentally map out scenarios, playing through possibilities like a chess grandmaster considering moves. What would happen if extradition was approved? What were his legal options? Could he appeal, and on what grounds? What allies did he still have outside these walls who might intervene? He thought through escape possibilities, not because he seriously believed he could execute them from solitary confinement, but because the planning itself was empowering. Guard schedules, prison layouts, potential vulnerabilities in the system. He cataloged everything he knew and extrapolated what he didn't, building mental models of the institution that held him. He also thought about his former colleagues, the other members of the Medellin cartel. Pablo Escobar was still at large, still fighting his war against the Colombian government and the American DEA. The Ochoa brothers were dealing with their own legal troubles. What allegiances still held? Who could he trust, if anyone? The narco world was built on pragmatism and self-interest. Loyalty lasted exactly as long as it was mutually beneficial. The nights, the final period before he designated a new day, were the hardest. This was when the isolation hit heaviest, when the darkness felt most oppressive, when the phantom sounds became most insistent. Carlos developed elaborate rituals to combat the creeping dread that came with the darkness. He would tell himself stories, narrating his own life as if he were a character in a novel. He started from childhood, from his earliest memories of Quindío, the coffee region where he was born. He remembered his father's German precision, his insistence on excellence and discipline, his mother's Colombian warmth, her laughter that could fill a room. He traced his path from that beginning through school, through his brief time in the United States where he had been arrested for car theft and served his first prison sentence, through his introduction to the cocaine trade and his meteoric rise to power. The narration served multiple functions. It reinforced his identity when isolation threatened to dissolve the self. It provided narrative coherence to a life that sometimes felt random and chaotic, and it allowed him to examine his choices with a degree of objectivity, to see patterns and motivations that he had missed while living through events. Some nights, when the darkness felt particularly heavy, Carlos would sing quietly, barely above a whisper, but singing nonetheless. German folk songs his father had taught him, Colombian vallenatos his mother had loved, American rock and roll he had heard on radios during smuggling flights. The singing felt ridiculous, embarrassing, even though no one could hear, but it filled the silence with something other than his own spiraling thoughts. Around what he estimated was the 3-week mark, something shifted. Carlos woke one morning, or approximated waking, the distinction still uncertain, with a clarity that felt almost transcendent. The physical pain had receded to a dull background ache, manageable and ignorable. His mind felt sharp, focused, like a blade that had been honed through repeated use. He realized he had adapted. The cell that had initially felt like a tomb now felt almost familiar, its dimensions and limitations integrated into his consciousness. The isolation that had threatened to break him had instead forced him to discover resources within himself he hadn't known existed. He was not whole. Solitary confinement left scars on the psyche just as surely as violence left scars on the body, but he was functional, resilient, unbroken. They wanted to destroy me, Carlos thought with something approaching wonder, and instead they made me stronger. It was an illusion, he knew. Solitary confinement had taken its toll in ways he probably wouldn't fully understand for years, but the perception of strength was itself a kind of strength, a psychological armor that could carry him through whatever came next. Dr. Vargas came for a final medical evaluation around this time, examining Carlos's wounds with professional thoroughness. The abdominal scar had healed well, pink and raised but sealed. The ribs had knitted sufficiently to no longer require wrapping. The head wound was now just a faint line hidden beneath his hairline. Physically, you're recovered, Vargas announced. Better than I expected, honestly. I've seen men come out of solitary shadows of themselves. You look, well, not good, but functional. I've had good motivation to stay functional, Carlos replied. What happens now? That's above my pay grade, Vargas said. But I've been told to declare you medically cleared. What that means for your confinement status, I don't know. What it meant became clear 2 days later when Captain Morales appeared at his cell door with news that felt simultaneously like salvation and damnation. Your solitary period is complete, letter. You're being moved back to general population tomorrow. Carlos absorbed this information, his mind immediately racing through the implications. Back to the same cell block. No, different wing. We're taking precautions, separating you from certain elements, from the people who tried to kill me, you mean, among others. And what's to stop them from trying again? Different wing doesn't mean different prison. El Pulpo and his friends will still be here, still connected, still motivated. Morales's expression was carefully neutral. That's a valid concern, but I don't make these decisions. The warden has determined that your solitary period has been served and you're being returned to general population. My advice, keep your head down, avoid confrontations, trust no one. Solid advice for prison life, Carlos said dryly. I'll be sure to follow it. After Morales left, Carlos sat on his concrete shelf and contemplated what returning to general population meant. On one hand, it was a relief, an end to the crushing isolation, a return to human contact and social interaction. On the other hand, it was a return to danger, to the complex hierarchies and violent politics of prison society. He spent that final night in solitary preparing himself mentally for the transition. He had survived the isolation by building an internal world rich enough to sustain him. Now he would need to rebuild his external presence to reassert himself in a social environment where he had been absent for over a month. They tried to kill me once, Carlos thought. They'll try again, but I'm not the same man who went into solitary. I'm harder now, clearer, more focused. Let them try, let them all try. As he drifted into sleep for the last time in that dark cell, Carlos later felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: anticipation. Not happiness or joy, but the sharp edge of readiness, the mental preparation for whatever battle came next. He had survived solitary confinement. Compared to that, the politics of general population felt almost manageable. Almost. The morning of his return to general population, Carlos woke early from habit, his internal clock having adjusted to the rhythms he had imposed during solitary. The guards came at what felt like dawn, though without natural light it could have been any hour. They handcuffed him, standard procedure for moving prisoners, and led him through corridors he barely remembered, his eyes struggling to adjust to the relative brightness after weeks of near total darkness. The new cell block was in the eastern wing of the prison, structurally identical to his previous location, but populated by a different subset of the inmate hierarchy. As the guards walked him through, Carlos felt dozens of eyes tracking his movement. Word had spread, as it always did in prison. Everyone knew who he was, what had happened in the yard, his month in solitary. He was being evaluated, assessed, categorized by men whose survival depended on accurately reading threats and opportunities. His new cell was marginally better than the old one, slightly larger, with a window that actually admitted air and indirect sunlight. His cellmate was already there, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades navigating prison life. He looked up as Carlos entered, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with intelligence. "Carlos' letter," the man said, not a question but an acknowledgement. "I'm Joaquin Rojas. I've been told we're sharing accommodations." "Temporarily, I assume," Carlos replied, "sitting on the unclaimed bunk, unless you're also waiting for extradition." "Trafficking charges, but domestic. I'll be here for a while yet." Rojas studied him openly. "They put you with me because I don't have cartel affiliations. Neutral territory, you might say. And they think that keeps me safe? Safer than the alternative. But letter, if I may offer some unsolicited advice, the men who tried to kill you haven't forgotten. They're in different wings, but prison is a small world. Revenge has a long half-life here." Carlos appreciated the direct honesty. "I'll keep that in mind." The first few days back in general population were a study in careful navigation. Carlos moved through the prison with deliberate awareness, never turning his back to open spaces, always noting exits and potential threats. He ate in the common dining area surrounded by hundreds of men engaged in their own dramas and power struggles, but he chose his seat carefully, back to the wall, clear sight lines to all approaches. The narcos in this wing were a different group than his previous block, mid-level operators and facilitators rather than major players. They recognized his name and reputation but kept a respectful distance, aware that association with him might draw unwanted attention from both guards and rival inmates. Carlos found himself in a strange liminal space, respected but isolated, feared but not necessarily supported. On his fourth day back, an unexpected visitor appeared during recreation time. A young man, perhaps 25, approached with the careful body language of someone trying not to appear threatening. He stopped at a respectful distance and spoke quietly. "Senor Later, my name is David Mendoza. I wanted to tell you what you did in the yard, standing up to El Pulpo's crew. It gave me courage. I've been having trouble with some guys from the Cali distribution network, and watching how you fought even when outnumbered, it helped." Carlos studied the young man, seeing genuine admiration in his eyes. It was an unexpected gift, this notion that his violence and subsequent suffering had inspired someone else. How did it help specifically? "I reported them to the guards instead of just taking it, filed a formal complaint. They probably won't face real consequences, but at least it's documented. At least I didn't just disappear." David hesitated, then added, "Some of the younger guys we talk about you, about how you built something from nothing, how you stood up to the Americans even when everyone said it was impossible. You matter to us." After David left, Carlos sat with that conversation, turning it over in his mind. He had never thought of himself as inspirational, had never sought to be anyone's hero. He had built his empire for personal reasons, ambition, greed, the desire for power and freedom, but intentions didn't control impact. His story, his choices, his very existence had taken on meaning beyond his control. It was sobering and slightly terrifying. Legacy was a strange thing, he reflected. You didn't get to choose it or control how it manifested. You simply lived your life, made your choices, and other people extracted whatever meaning served their own narratives. The weeks passed with the peculiar rhythm of prison time, simultaneously slow and fast. Days were long, filled with the tedious routines of institutional life, but weeks vanished, months accumulating without clear demarcation. Carlos maintained his disciplines from solitary, the exercises, the mental work, the structured engagement with his own consciousness, but he also relearned social skills that had atrophied in isolation. He played dominoes with Joaquin in the evenings, their games serving as both entertainment and education. Joaquin had been in prison for 7 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of its politics and personalities. He explained the current alignments, who was allied with whom, where the real power lay behind the official hierarchy. "The guards think they run this place," Joaquin explained one evening, setting down a double six with a satisfied click. "But the real power is with the money. The narcos control the flow of contraband, cigarettes, drugs, cell phones, even food. Everything has a price, and everything can be acquired for the right price." "Including assassination?" Carlos asked. "Especially assassination. But it's more complicated now. The attempt on you failed, and that matters. In prison logic, a failed hit doesn't just leave you alive, it makes you stronger. You survived, which means either you're protected by something they didn't account for, or you're simply too tough to kill easily. Either way, the cost of trying again has gone up." Carlos found comfort in this analysis, though he knew better than to trust completely in economic deterrence. Money could always override logic, and revenge often operated independent of rational calculation. But for now, he was alive, and that was what mattered. The extradition proceedings continued their slow bureaucratic progression. Carlos met periodically with a lawyer the Colombian court had appointed, a competent but overworked public defender who was frank about the odds. The Americans wanted him badly, and the political pressure was immense. The Colombian Constitution's prohibition on extradition was being challenged, reinterpreted, potentially amended. It was only a matter of time. How much time, Carlos had asked during one consultation. Months, maybe a year if we can drag out the appeals. But eventually, Senor Leader, you will be extradited. The question is what you do with the time you have before that happens. What he did was read. Finally, books began appearing in his cell, passed along through the prison's informal lending library. He devoured them: fiction, history, philosophy, anything that engaged his mind beyond the immediate concerns of survival. He read 100 Years of Solitude and recognized elements of his own life in Garcia Marquez's magical realism. He read Camus's The Stranger and found unexpected resonance in Mirsalt's existential detachment. He also began to write using contraband paper and pencil acquired through Joaquin's connections. Not memoirs exactly, he wasn't ready for that level of confession or self-examination, but fragments, observations, philosophical musings on power and freedom and the nature of empire. The writing was private, something for himself rather than any imagined audience, but it served the same function as his mental exercises. It was an assertion of self, a refusal to be reduced to merely a body in a cage. 6 months after returning to general population, Carlos received news that changed everything. Captain Morales delivered it personally. His expression grave: Pablo Escobar is dead, killed by Colombian forces in Medellin yesterday. Carlos sat down slowly on his bunk, absorbing this information. Pablo, brilliant, brutal, megalomaniacal Pablo, had been the center of the Medellin cartel, the man whose vision and violence had made them all rich and powerful. His death wasn't unexpected. He had been at war with the government for years, but it still felt seismic, like a fundamental rule of reality had been violated. How? Carlos asked. Rooftop gunfight. They tracked him to a safe house and surrounded it. He died trying to escape. He died on his feet, Carlos thought. Fighting to the last. That's something, at least. Pablo's death reverberated through the prison for weeks. For some narcos, it was a warning of what awaited them all: eventual defeat, death, or extradition. For others, it was inspiration, proof that you could fight the system even if you ultimately lost. For Carlos, it was more personal. Pablo had been a colleague, sometime friend, occasional rival. His absence left a void in Carlos's understanding of the world. It also clarified certain things. With Pablo dead, the Medellin cartel was functionally dissolved. The Cali cartel would expand to fill the vacuum. The Americans would claim victory while new traffickers emerged to feed the insatiable demand. And Carlos later, once a king of this underworld, was now just a relic, a footnote in a history that was already moving beyond him. The realization was strangely liberating. For years, he had defined himself through his role in the cocaine trade, the architect of smuggling routes, the visionary who saw opportunity in the Caribbean's geography. But that role was gone, rendered obsolete by circumstance and capture. What remained was just Carlos, the man underneath the legend. On a warm afternoon, nearly a year after his return to general population, Carlos was sitting in the exercise yard when a familiar face appeared. El Pulpo, Miguel Ochoa, released from his own stint in solitary and reassigned to a different cell block. They saw each other across the yard, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. El Pulpo started walking toward him, and Carlos's body tensed, ready for violence. But as the man approached, Carlos saw something different in his bearing, not aggression, but something more complicated. El Popo stopped at a respectful distance, his hands visible and empty. "Let her," he said. "I'm not here to fight." "Then why are you here?" "To tell you I'm done. The people who paid me to kill you, they're not paying any more. Pablo's dead, things have changed, and honestly, you're not worth the trouble you'd cause." He paused, then added with something that might have been respect, "You're harder to kill than I expected. That's worth acknowledging." Carlos studied him carefully, looking for deception, but El Pulpo seemed genuine. "So we're what friends now?" "Never that, but maybe not enemies. In here, we have to live with each other. Might as well have some kind of understanding." After El Popo left, Carlos reflected on the strange ethics of prison life, where attempted murder could be set aside with a conversation, where yesterday's assassin could become today's neutral party. It was pragmatism in its purest form, survival logic stripped of sentiment. There was also something else, a demonstration that change was possible, that positions weren't fixed, that even in the most rigid of systems, there was fluidity and adaptation. If El Popo could move past the failed hit, maybe Carlos could move past the role that had defined him for so long. The final months before his extradition, for it was coming, inevitably, inexorably, Carlos spent preparing himself mentally for what lay ahead. American prison would be different from Colombian prison in 1,000 ways, most of them harsher. He would be truly isolated there, cut off from family and the culture that had shaped him, trapped in a system designed to erase identity and crush resistance. But he had learned something crucial during his month in solitary. The one thing they couldn't take was what he carried inside his mind, his memories, his sense of self. These were fortresses that could withstand any assault as long as he refused to surrender them. The Americans could take his freedom, his future, even his body eventually. But his internal world, the kingdom of consciousness he had built through discipline and will, that remained his. On his last day in Barranquilla before the extradition to Jacksonville, Carlos had a final conversation with Joaquin. They played one last game of dominoes, neither particularly focused on winning, just enjoying the companionable silence. "What will you do in America?" Joaquin asked. "Survive. The same thing I've been doing." Carlos placed a domino thoughtfully. "Maybe write something down someday. Tell the story the way I remember it, not the way the prosecutors will present it." "And what is the story as you remember it?" Carlos considered this carefully. "It's about a man who saw an opportunity and took it, who built something extraordinary and lost it all, who learned that freedom is internal, not external, and that dignity is something you choose every day regardless of circumstances." He smiled slightly. "It's also about a lot of cocaine and a lot of money, but the money's gone and the cocaine destroyed as many lives as it enriched. So what's left is just the lesson that you define yourself by how you respond to what happens, not by what happens itself." Joaquin nodded slowly. "That's a hard lesson to learn, harder to live. And everything worthwhile is hard. That's how you know it matters." The next morning, American marshals came for him, their presence alien and official in the chaotic environment of the Colombian prison. They handcuffed him, shackled his legs, and led him through corridors filled with men who had been his neighbors, his fellow travelers in this purgatory. Some called out farewells, others watched in silence, but all marked his passage as significant. As Carlos was loaded into the armored transport that would take him to the airport, he looked back at the prison one final time. It had been hell, certainly violent, degrading, designed to break human spirits, but it had also been a crucible, a place where he had discovered resources within himself he hadn't known existed. The boy who had left Colombia for America decades ago had been seeking adventure and opportunity. The man who had built a cocaine empire had been seeking power and wealth. The prisoner being extradited to American justice was seeking something different, a version of himself that could survive with dignity intact regardless of external circumstances. Carlos Rivas closed his eyes as the transport pulled away, listening to the engine's rumble, feeling the movement that would carry him toward whatever future awaited. He had lost almost everything, his empire, his freedom, his country, but he still had himself, the irreducible core of consciousness that no cell could contain and no sentence could destroy. In the end, he reflected maybe that was enough, maybe that was victory, of a kind, not the victory he had imagined when he ruled an island and moved tons of cocaine, but a deeper, more fundamental triumph. He had been tested and hadn't broken. He had faced the abyss and hadn't been consumed. Whatever came next, years in American maximum security solitary confinement again, perhaps the rest of his life in a cage, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else, with awareness, with discipline, with the knowledge that the one thing they could never take was the kingdom inside his skull, where he remained always and forever free. The transport merged onto the highway toward Bogota's airport, and Carlos began the next chapter of his life, carrying with him the hard-won lessons of survival and the unshakable conviction that dignity once claimed could never be truly stolen.